is Julie Pearson, Little Thunder. Today is Saturday, September 9th, and I'm interviewing Norman Akers as part of the Oklahoma Native Artists Project, sponsored by the Oklahoma Oral Histories Research Program at Oklahoma State University. We're at Norman's home, just outside of Lawrence. You're a well-known painter and printmaker, a recipient of the prestigious Gene Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Grant, and a professor of painting at the University of Kansas. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, you're welcome, Julie.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Well, I was actually born in Fairfax, Oklahoma, so I was raised in Osage County, and I spent pretty much all my youth, there. I did go to high school at Skytook, for a while, which is not too far from Tulsa. However, it seemed like my life was so connected to Fairfax, that every weekend I went back to Fairfax, and, and it was sort of an odd growing up, in a way, but no, Fairfax is my home, and it's an important place, for me. Maybe jumping a little bit ahead, but I know I've always had this strong connection to home and still trying to maintain, close ties with family and community, there.
How about your folks?
Well, I'm mixed blood. My father is Osage, my mother's Anglo, and my father was typical of most Osages from that time period. He grew up in Oklahoma. He went to boarding school, and that whole experience. Mm-hmm. And my mother, she had lived both in Oklahoma, around Tulsa, Fairfax, Pawnee, that kind of area. That's where her folks were from, and when they got married after, she finished up her high school, in Fairfax, and so that was pretty much it. And she's still living in Oklahoma, mm-hmm. and she worked for the Osage County, at the courthouse for a number of years, and also the assessor's office.
How about your grandparents? Were they around at all, either side?
I spent quite a bit of time with my grandparents. I mean, on my mother's side, in one way I felt like probably a good part of my youth was spent around them, because she was busy, working and everything, and that. My grandmother on my father's side, she died quite young, and so I never knew her, but I knew my great-grandmother on my father's side, and so the early part of my life, there was a very strong connection, with her, which I think in many ways.
What was her name?
Her name was Eva, actually Little Star. She went by Star, shortened the name.
Yeah.
But she was, and she was very instrumental, in my life for the time that I knew her, because I sort of felt like somewhere, that connection sort of gave me a stronger connection to home, in a sense, but I had sort of felt like, I really did spend a lot of my growing up with my grandparents, mm-hmm. Which kind of, I think, changed how I looked at people, in a sense. It was a different kind of...
In what way?
I don't know. I guess I was used to being around older people, for one. And also there was something about work ethic. My grandfather was not the type of person to sit around. And so, so I literally did grow up every weekend. Every weekend there was some sort of project that we worked on. So whether I was spending time sort of just fiddling with his tools or being what I would call a tool monkey, just like, and that was just part of growing up. And I really haven't talked much about him, so this is kind of the first time in an interview I'm sort of reminiscing, I guess, about my relationship with him, because he was a real sort of quiet man, didn't have a whole lot to say. If something bothered him, he'd let you know. But he was, best way I can describe it, he was very inquisitive. He was always sort of fascinated with things, how things worked. And I think somehow growing up and being around him, that sort of made me think that way. I mean, I told someone a funny story a while back, and it was like when microwave ovens came out. And I could remember him taking me to the furniture store so I could watch them cook a hot dog in a microwave oven. And I think, that was his excuse for getting out of the house. But I still remember that crazy experience of going to the furniture store in Fairfax and watching them cook hot dogs and hamburgers in a microwave oven. It sounds, it's funny, and I start to think back on it, and I realize, oh wow, that's.
But a sense of curiosity.
It's a curiosity, but we think of microwaves as being commonplace.
Right.
Today. And so anyway.
Now, are you Osage and Pawnee?
I'm actually Osage.
Okay.
And that's.
I'm glad we can clarify then.
That's always been sort of complicated, and I think as many people know in Native country, there's so my grandfather was Osage, and he wasn't Pawnee, but my last name Akers is connected to a Pawnee man, and I knew him when I was young. He was. I have memories of him, as well, and then, but I've got family over, in Hominy, as well. In fact, I'm related to Anita Fields. Her Uncle Richard, her dad was my father's uncle.
Okay.
And so it's kind of connection among Osage artists.
Yes.
As well. So that kind of sorts a little bit of that out, because I ran into that quite a bit in the past, and likewise I know that my father, when he was young, after he lost his mother, there were a lot of things going on that he was raised over in Pawnee for a while. It was just that time, and it was that, how people were.
Right.
Then, and,
Well, what is your first memory of seeing art?
There was a lady named Helen Bear who lived in Fairfax, and her grandsons and I were really close friends, and her daughter Alice Couch was a close friend of my mother's, so we had that connection. And what I remembered about Helen Bear's house was it was sort of salon style. She had old photographs, those old round oval photographs of her parents and great grandparents or whatever, relatives, pictures, but she had a collection of paintings from people like Fred Beaver and Blue Eagle and that whole Bacon school. And apparently when she was younger, she must have either known or she had collected these artists. So whenever I would go over to play, I always felt like I would spend a moment looking at all the paintings and things in her house. And that was probably the first time that I could really think about like seeing paintings, because I didn't grow up going to museums. Museums were something that we just didn't do, for the most part. However, somehow I had a very sort of strong interest in drawing, and sculpting clay, and my parents and grandparents were very sort of supportive of that, because I'm pretty sure when I was involved in things like that, I wasn't bothering them, and I kind of joke about it, because usually when I engage in some sort of project, I'm very obsessive. And I remembered as a kid, I was extremely obsessive about if I was going to sculpt something or make something, you know, I would spend hours on it.
Wow.
And the same thing with drawing.
So are we talking sort of Play-Doh or?
Play-Doh, clay, just old modeling clay,
yeah.
you know, and things like that. And I was always figuring, I mean, some of my very earliest memories were like building little towns underneath this apricot tree that we had, you know, next to the house, and you know, would flood the place, and then literally take the mud and start pushing it and carving and making all sorts of little buildings and things, and you know, so it was a very sort of I think growing up, it was very imaginative, and you know, very involved in just that kind of notion of making, as I said, of just making, and it's funny because some of my earliest memories too, I could remember the postage stamps, and it would always tear the postage stamps off of the letters that came to the house, and it used to be like all you would get were images of George Washington, you know, that same postage stamp, and when the commemorative stamps started coming out, you know, and I would find one that, you know, a letter that would come and it would have like this little, I would tear it off and I would actually glue it to the floorboards of the house, and I could remember laying down on the floor and looking at these little postage
just
stamps.
enjoying the visual
enjoying the
effect
images,
of,
you know, on there. And it dawned on me, I was creating my own little museum.
wow.
It was a little gallery. It was just, you know, they were just tiny little pictures, you know, in a sense. And this was long before, as I said, I went to museums. But for some reason, was just really kind of inquisitive, like make things, and I don't think I was really a good student.
Yeah, I was going to ask about like art experiences once you got into, let's start with elementary school.
Yeah, because I mean, when I was in elementary school and grade school, you know, I wasn't a good student, you know, for the most part. And I think there were a number of issues I was kind of dealing with. One was glasses. You know, I found that actually I couldn't see, which set me back a year. And also, but somehow making art was one thing that I sort of excelled at.
Did you?
And most of my instructors recognized that.
Oh, they did.
Yeah,
so
for some reason I was just again real fortunate that people picked up on it. I think in my whole sort of experience in grade school and junior high and in high school, I can think of only maybe a couple of times where I had an instructor that really tried to push that down. You know, they wasn't receptive to it, but just about everybody was sort of engaged in, because also I was extremely shy and backwards. I mean, it may not appear that way now, but you know, it was very quiet, you know, and that took a long time for me to get over. You know.
What's one of your, I guess, more outstanding memories of just an interaction with a teacher or a project that you finished that you were happy about?
You know, I did a number of projects. There was a doctor in Skiatook. His name was Dr. Wolf, and he had just built a new clinic. And I remembered I did like 2 or 3 murals for him.
In high school?
You know, in high school. And this was right before this was during my senior year. And he you know, paid me, you know, appropriately for them. And I can't even remember what it was. And actually, I never got the money. The deal was that he put it towards my first year of college.
Wow.
And so that helped me, you know, to go to the Kansas City Art Institute. And you know, which was a wise thing. I mean, he was, you know, I mean, let's face it, an 18-year-old getting a lot of money. And so, and I remember he had a big, like, grand opening and everything, and they had a reception and, like, an awards ceremony, and it was the first time that I ever kind of dealt with this. And the other
For
thing,
you,
for,
when you
for,
completed
yeah,
that.
for the whole the clinic and everything.
The clinic
And being the sort of the
Yeah.
I guess you would call it the guest artist.
Oh,
in a
that's
sense. And so
wonderful.
it was a marvelous experience. Also at the same time, the high school counselor had invited Brummett Echohawk
Wow.
to come to speak to me, talk to me, and I showed my portfolio to Brummett. And we got to visiting, and he knew my grandfather from my Pawnees, you know, the connection, and that, and so it was, you know, it was really interesting. And what, you know, struck me about my meeting with Brummett was that, he was, you know, I respect the fact that he was generous with his time, and he provided some wise advice. And he actually gave me a real critique. He didn't say, "Oh, this is nice. This is really good. Good. You're on your way to being an artist." You know, that's not what I got. You know, I got, well, this is what you need to think about this. You need to do this. You know, this is kind of working, but you know, you still have a long ways to go. and you know, and that was good.
Yeah.
I mean, and likewise, I think, you know, he asked me, he said, "Well, where are you going?" And I said, I'm looking at the Institute of American Indian Arts, or I'm looking at maybe one of the state schools. And he said, "Well, if you can go to an art institute, you know, you need to do that," because he said, there's no sense in like doing a 2-year degree. You know, or that if you can find you a good school, and you can, you know, afford it, do that. And so that kind of directed me to the Kansas City Art Institute, because I thought about Chicago, and growing up in Fairfax, that wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Kansas City was
Going
big
on
enough.
from
Kansas
Sky
City
to Fairfax.
Kansas City was big enough,
Yeah.
you know, and it was close enough to home, because I was still having this like attachment issue too. It's like, you know, 250 miles was tolerable, but not 700.
Right. So you
In a
didn't
sense.
really know anybody in Kansas City, but it was closer.
It was close. It was close,
It was
and
had a good reputation.
and it had a good reputation, and so, you know, my folks, they took his advice, and that was, you know, as I said, it made a difference in my life, you know, and eventually I did go back to II, you know,
Right.
which we can chat about.
Right. So what was before entering the KC Art Institute, what was your style and subject matter?
Probably just like about any other sort of adolescent from that mid-70s, record album art. You know, I wanted to do record covers, you know, cartoons. I drew airplanes instead of hot rods for some reason. I never had a fascination with cars. I did a lot of copies too of other artists' work, and I mean, I copied a lot of Alan Hauser. I copied a lot of
We're talking painting.
painting. Yeah, like Fred Beaver.
Right.
You know, things that I could find photographs in magazines and things. I copied those. I had an art instructor, and I don't know whatever happened to him. His name was Bob Wade, and he was actually kind of, I think, a /basketball coach, art instructor. And this was when I was in Skytook, and he was giving me a lot of these things. He gave me a book on Catlin, and I remembered I copied, I don't know how many of those Catlin paintings, you know, and that, and it was kind of interesting because I always sort of, you know, I both kind of enjoyed doing it. I remember growing up making these pictures of straight dancers and Roman soldiers because I liked that crested, you know. And so there was this weird sort of multicultural thing going on, even as a youth.
Yeah.
And you know, but I think, like with all young people, you kind of rebel.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like, there were pictures of, I was sort of being pushed. My father was like, you need to paint, this is what you need to paint. I go, no, and of course, what he considered art, was that Oklahoma style, but also Remington and Russell. It was that whole Western sort of, let's face it, Cowboy Hall of Fame kind of aesthetic, in a sense. And I mean, I have funny stories about that too, because, he would sort of kind of dangle the carrot. He said, yeah, I'll give you some money to go to school on, but you got to make me a painting. so I've done my fair share of buffalo hunts.
Wow.
Which in retrospect, I look back and they were fun.
You were still practicing.
Yeah, I was practicing my skills, and but that was the kind of work that I was doing, before I went to the Art Institute. I will tell you a funny story real quick, just so, because it's on my mind here. One of those incidences where my father would say, well, he said, yeah, I'll give you some money to go to school on. And I was like, but you got to paint a picture of a headdress on a rock. And he kind of got impatient with me because it took a while, And then finally I said, I got it. And he said, well, where's it at? And pulled out this tea towel, handed it to him. And he just kind of looked bewildered. And I just finally looked and said, it took me a long time to find the right kind of rock to paint that headdress on. And he just looked and he said, we really do think differently, don't we?
Wow.
And he wanted, of course, as you can imagine, a regular painting. So I went out on the prairie and I spent all this time wandering around trying to find the right kind of rock, to do this painting on, in a sense, which was kind of funny. But kind of getting back on track here. When my first year at the Art Institute was, I was really, I had no idea. I was completely lost. I went into a foundations program and was introduced to all sorts of new ways of making art. Kind of new ways of thinking. It really sort of shook and kind of destabilized my notion of what art was. And I found that, I think that experience was extremely good. I could remember calling home and saying, I have no idea what I'm doing. I just hope I'm doing the right thing.
Are you about 19 or?
I was 18.
18.
Yeah. And but what I remembered about it was extremely rigorous, and having a work ethic was never an issue with me. And that came from growing up. I just knew that if I had to be there all day to do it, then I did it. And it was, I remember my first art history class. I mean, I really did look at people like Picasso and Monet, the Impressionists. I just thought that was kind of strange painting. And I didn't understand why it was good or anything. But what I found was that I went to the library like once a week and checked out just books. I wasn't really reading them, I was just looking at images. And I kept looking at images. And I just wanted to know, well, what makes this good, in a sense. And actually that habit still kind of stays with me. I found over the years I've managed to purchase a lot of books, but I still, even though I'm here at KU now, I still go to the library fairly regularly and just go through and just grab books just so I can look at, images. I mean, it's a little dated now with the internet, and that sort of accessibility to information. But for some reason, I enjoy just being in the library and being able to physically hold a book and thumb through it, and there's something, as I said, very tangible about having that book in your hand. In a sense that's important.
So you got your takeaway from the Kansas City Art Institute. Would you describe it as basically a foundational one. What did you take away from that?
I think when I left the Art Institute, I realized that I had actually achieved my objective. You know, I had a good understanding of what art was. And one thing I'll say is I dropped out for 1 year, you know, and worked in a factory and went over to Europe and looked at paintings.
Really?
You know, and I had some help
Wow.
from my father, you know, and that's when I was over in Europe, I realized, oh yeah, this is what I want to do the rest of my life, is make paintings.
What a great education that was.
And it was incredible. I don't think my parents thought I was going to do it, you know, because I went by myself and spent a little over 2 months roaming around, you know, and you know, to museums and cities, and you know, and they said it was a good experience. But no, when I left the Art Institute, I felt like I was making competent paintings. I had a good basis in art history.
Were you embarked on this sort of path of non-realism, sort of?
Yeah, I was. I mean, my goal was, you know, to try to go from realism to abstraction, but to understand what abstraction was. And of course, good abstraction, from my perspective, is still based in some sort of realism. It has its roots to something real, whether it's emotional or physical. And what I found was that was what was happening with my painting. More and more, as it was beginning to abstract, in a sense, I was still seeing the connection back to something, you know, real. And of course, I mean, I think that echoes my life, you know, in many ways, because I mean, as an artist, I moved away from Oklahoma. I moved away from that little community that I grew up. Had grown and sort of expanded an awful lot, and yeah, my ideas can be a little, you know, different, you know, at times. But the thing about them is that they still make this sort of connection back to place.
So you are painting with oils on acrylics, basically?
I was primarily doing oil painting.
Okay.
It just got introduced to printmaking when I was at the Art Institute.
Okay.
Did some intaglio classes and did a lithography class, but as I said, it was mainly painting.
Mm-hmm.
And
So then you decide to get a certificate of museum studies. Is that correct? At the
Yes.
institute. That's where you go. Is there a time lapse between your BFA and?
Actually, no, not very much. I think it was within a year that I went out to Santa Fe.
Mm-hmm.
I was also, bear in mind, Wendy Ponca was at the Art Institute when I was there, and Wendy and I are related.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and of course I knew Carl, her dad, and Carl went out to Santa Fe to teach at that time, and he just kind of looked. He said, "Norman, I need some help moving." He said, "You want to come along?" I said, "Sure." You know, didn't have anything else to do, and somehow after I was out there, he kind of coerced me into going to school. And actually, it was good because the minute I landed in Santa Fe, I was like, "Oh, this is a very interesting place. I'd like to figure out how to stay." And
So you weren't so much interested in museum studies per se.
No, I
don't know if that's a brand new degree then. Either.
No, I have to. I went and I did museum studies because I'd already had a studio degree, and then I have to admit I was sort of worried about, well, how do you make a living as an artist? And I said this type of experience can translate into a job,
Right.
and you know, I have to say that. As a student, I was only at II for probably maybe a year. You know, because one is I just went in and I did the certificate. There was no messing around. It was done. And they were on a block system at the time, and I think I actually did it in the 3 blocks. You know, but I took printmaking courses there at the time.
Yeah.
And because I had just got enough of a taste of it at Kansas City, and you can say one of the things, I'm going to go back to my high school experience. One of the things that I remember this fellow Bob Wade did, he gave me a book or a magazine that had a whole series of prints that were made at II, and they were artists like Kevin Redstar, Earl Biss, T.C. Cannon, the whole, you know what I mean?
Big guys,
they're kind of like the big guys of
The
II.
big guys, yeah.
And other people. And I remember I was fascinated with those images. And so yeah, that was the other thing that kind of drew me back, to the printmaking, and I have to say, I think I don't know if it's really, people focus on it that much, but I think II has had a very strong and rich history in printmaking.
In that specific
area. I mean, there's been so many artists that have came out of, the school, and have produced really incredible prints. And so...
And you were mentioning that Seymour Tubas wasn't there anymore.
No, he wasn't there.
What was the instruction situation?
The instruction situation I felt was, and I probably am going to be a little critical with this, it was pretty loose at the time. And I'm not going to name any names or anything, but I'll just say I felt like we were sort of fending for ourselves in a way. I was, the time that I was working at IA in the printmaking studio, there was Michael McCabe, Bobby Emerson Kitzman, Joe McNamara, and there was a few others as well, but I think of those three primarily. And we kind of had free reign of the studio. We had the keys, and so we were printing till like 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, almost every night. And I can remember is like in a semester we'd pump out, 6 or 7 editions.
And you were marketing them a little bit in town.
Oh yeah, of course. Immediately realized I could take the work to the, to the IA Museum.
Right.
And Chuck Daly was the director there, and they had a little space where they sold student work. And of course, the minute we'd edition a print, you'd pull one out and, get it shrunk wrapped or matted and take it to the museum and wait. Basically tell you, and so, yeah, I did an awful lot of that. But there was I think, II was an incredible place. It is an incredible place because, it expanded my worldview, particularly of Native America, because, as I say, growing up in Oklahoma, it was very limited, in my things, in my understanding. The world, when I was at II, was connected with other people from the Southwest, Navajo people, Pueblo people, people from up north, and so that I think was just extremely exciting. I think another thing too that happened, and this kind of came out, of my experience at the Art Institute in Kansas City. I realized everything that I was focusing on was very sort of Western. It was looking at the history of Renaissance painting, contemporary American art, European art. My objective to become like an abstract expressionist, in a sense, was very sort of Eurocentric in its direction. And II kind of changed that. And it was sort of interesting because probably the one person I sort of connected with at II was Barbara Emerson Kitzman, because she was a landscape painter. And both of us painted landscapes. And so we traveled around. When I say we would get together, travel and paint around Santa Fe.
Oh, that's cool. Do plein air.
Things like that. Do plein air painting. And, and it was kind of funny because I think some of the other students at IA kind of looked at, well, why are you doing that? So, just because I like to be outside, like to paint landscapes, in a sense. So in a strange way, I didn't totally fit in II because of the work was I think I was dealing with other things besides dealing with the market in Santa Fe. I wasn't trying to make just images that were simply about going into the Santa Fe market. Although I think the longer that I stayed there, the more I started doing that, because I was there, I think, in Santa Fe for probably about 4 years the first time. And the whole time I was in New Mexico, from like 82 to 88, I was kind of bouncing back and forth between Oklahoma and Santa Fe.
So when you started sort of moving that direction, was it just out of necessity, or was it like just that the influence is so pervasive that you sort of...
It was definitely the influence. I mean, let's face it, adobe houses fascinated me. We were talking a little bit earlier about the first time you had seen some of the work.
Right.
And I was doing these serigraphs, because what I loved about the houses was that they were brown, they were pink, they were earth colors, but they were skin colors. So they had this very organic feel, and they reminded me of people, and they had a personality. So I started off with a series of serigraphs called "Some Houses Remind You of People," and I was strongly influenced by the Southwest, and participated in Indian market for about, I think, 3, maybe 4 years.
That's good to know.
And
during those 80s.
During those 80s, I think the last time I did it might have been 3 years, because 1988 was the last year that I did that. And during that whole time I was doing market, I was really geared towards marketing work, selling work, and so I was really making a product.
Yeah.
In a sense, it was.
And you had to support yourself
That
too.
was,
You were out of school.
Basically it.
Yeah.
And so did a lot of. I think the last year that I did it, I shouldn't say the last couple of years I did it, I was starting to realize that was not where I wanted to be.
And then you ended up having yet another layer. They're wonderful, like, layers of these experiences, but you went to University of Illinois at Champaign.
Yes.
For what drew you over there?
Well, actually, there was 3 of us who were recruited. To the University of Illinois.
Okay.
And it was Marcus Ammerman, Charlene Teeters, and myself. And
That's a great trio.
yeah, it was. Marcus didn't stay very long. He was gone before the first semester. He realized that was not his path, in a sense. And Charlene and I were in the painting, program there, and I think for both of us it was an eye-opening experience. And you're familiar with Charlene's work, and her activism, and Chief Alina Wick and that, and I know when she was there, she was able to really sort of route that whole issue, the frustration with what was going on in the community and the school, and turn it into an art form, and she was very vocal and outward. For myself, I stayed in the studio, for the most part. I mean, Charlene would tease me, and she'd go, well, come out, let's go. I went out a few times with her, and I just said, this is way too public for me. I've never thought of myself as an activist. And it was so funny. It was about a year later, I was making these paintings, and I was still saying, I'm not an activist. And I was kind of looking at this big painting that I was doing, and the title of the painting was called "Collision of Heavenly Structures." And I kind of went, oh, yes, I am. I just don't realize it.
Certainly making political statements.
Well, but I think that's the case. Yeah. If you've grown up, as a Native person, politics has been a part of your life. If you have to deal with the agency, I still think about when people would come to the school and we would have these assemblies and they'd want you to raise your hand if you were Native. And I was, well, why are they doing that? Of course, it was to get money for the school, and that you know, or just other sort of things.
Right.
You know, you just realize that, you know, it's an inseparable part of your life, basically. You know.
Well, when you graduated from University of Illinois, what skills in terms of painting do you think you'd added, or was it an integration thing?
One of the things, I think my painting effectively changed, and again, it got more personal, and it was one of the first times I started feeling like I was really actually dealing with much more cultural information, notions about identity, you know, and place. And for some reason in Illinois, it kind of manifested there.
Yeah.
It was just something about really being away from home, or being disconnected from people that I knew, and so all of a sudden those issues became, you know, more important, you know, to me, and it kind of came out of this, you know. I remember one of the professors basically sort of said, "Your culture's dead. Why are you even dealing with it?" And you know, he said that early on, and that was a challenge to make sure that he was wrong. And somehow, I think Charlene and I both, you know, we were dealing with that, you know, and making sure that he was aware that no, it's alive and it's vibrant, and we're dealing, and you know, with issues, we're people. And that's, you know, well, what kind of happened. So I found my work, you know, was exploring these kind of notions of identity. You know, it was also probably the first time that I really started engaging in research, you know, and utilizing research to support, you know, my painting. So I was spending a lot of time going into the archives, and said I've got this strong connection with libraries anyway, you know, and so it was like doing a lot of reading, looking at old Smithsonian journals, looking at LaFlèche's writings, you know, on the Osage, and what else, you know, I could find. But I was making these sort of kind of large scale mythological paintings, you know, and they were sort of kind of a conglomerate of all sorts of ideas, mythologies and things, and they were sort of, in a way, was kind of creating these, again, these sort of mythic worlds. That's all I can really say. Somewhere within them, you know, I was sort of in there.
Right.
But I always sort of, you know, I felt like the paintings were really much more about that feeling of being disconnected. You know, that somehow psychologically, that was something I was dealing with, because Illinois, I spent 5 years there. I taught there 2 years after that. And I'm grateful, I'm thankful for that experience, because it moved my life forward. But I have to admit, I did not enjoy it. I remember calling one of my cousins up one time at home. I said, "I'm ready to go home." Hey, like, "You're not welcome." He said, "Stay where you're at. Stay where you're at. Do not go. Do not come back to home." And but yeah, that was, you know, yeah. I mean, and the other thing I was going to say was teaching. It was the first time I'd been in a classroom, and so, you know, I was teaching a wide range of courses. The chair of the painting department made sure that I taught, excuse me, taught maybe, you know, 1 or 2 courses a semester. So I actually got a lot of experience in the classroom, you know, when I was there. And you know, it started off awkward, and I have to admit, I never thought I would be in the role of a teacher, but somehow that's just been how my life has sort of unfolded.
Has it enriched your art, do you think, in any way?
Yeah. I mean, you know, when you're working with young people, And it's about an exchange of information. I don't think of myself as all-knowing, and I would never want to think that way. And to me, a healthy relationship, is about a dialogue, and it's about exchanging information and coming up with solutions and finding new directions. Something that moves, that student forward. Well, what also happens as an instructor is that dialogue and that engagement moves you forward. And to me, that's what I like about teaching, is that when it's going good, everybody's becoming enriched. And I think that's, that was probably the one major thing that I really got out of being in Illinois, and also I think that shift, in the work that I started dealing more so with the notion of self, and identity, in place. I mean, landscapes have been a part of my life, have been a part of my work for a long time. Those plein air paintings, I felt like they were documents of my sort of aimless wandering around in New Mexico. But finally what happens is that place became something real, and it was a place embedded with identity and culture, history.
You mentioned in an interview in 2000 that you'd been painting in Oklahoma then at that point and feeling kind of isolated. And I just wanted to follow up on that. If
I actually like isolation. After my stint at the University of Illinois, I went back to Fairfax and got me a studio above the police station, and which was actually a good place for me to be. And I painted. I just continued to make work, and part of it was I thought, well, I don't need an arts community. I can just paint here, and part of it was also economics. I didn't have a job, so it was easy to go home, cheap studio space, and so I did a lot of painting, and something happened that I think was really important was nominated for the Joan Mitchell Award Fellowship. And Joan Mitchell's out of New York City, and I remembered I was in Fairfax. I got this letter from them and opened it up, and it said, well, submit 6 slides. And that's all they wanted, was just images of your work. And, did that, put it in the mail, sent it back to them. A few months later, I got a letter back from them saying that I won this fellowship.
That's fantastic.
And something happened too, and that was that I realized that home fed me in a good way, that I could make art anywhere, and I could make work back in Oklahoma. You didn't need the art world for some reason. I don't know how to describe it, that there was enough there in that community, for me to make my work. And right at the same time that happened, someone called me up and wanted to know if I was interested in teaching out in New Mexico at II. So that was like a very important, probably 6 months in my life, because not only did I get the Joan Mitchell, but also went out to Santa Fe and started teaching at II.
And making some more prints too.
And making more prints and that. But no, it's, being a painter, and this is kind of, I have this discussion with my colleagues, here, because painting is a very solitary activity, and you have to kind of be, in that mindset. It's different from printmaking, or it's different from, say, glass blowing, or ceramics, where you're in a shop, working, where you depend on other people,
Right.
to sort of assist with the work. And that's probably, that's one reason why being a painter and a printmaker, to me, is I like being able to go kind of back and forth. I don't think a whole lot of collaborating that much, but the printmaker that I'm working with today, or in the last few years at Santa Fe, we collaborate. And to me, it's, I get to go out 3 to 4 times a year for about a week and just stay engaged in making prints. And it's just the most incredible collaboration, because he'll look and say, well, you can't do that. I said, well, why can't I? And oh, so it does work. And sometimes, yeah, you're right. But we talk. It's like banter about ideas and things. And I worked with this fellow named Mitchell Marty, who has a press out in Santa Fe, or outside of town. And it's just been an incredible working relationship. I mean, in the sense that when we do, he's just starting to publish some lithographs. And when we work on the lithographs, it's not me coming in with an idea, but I like to present 3 or 4 images, and we talk about it. And I go, well, which one are you interested in working on? Because as a printer, there's a creative element too. That's a part of that process. And so we have this kind of like long dialogue about it. And then say, well, okay, yeah, this is one. Let's work on this one. Well, what are the possibilities? And I think the last set of plates that we started, we said, well, let's try to keep it to no more than 5 plates. So we ended up doing 7 plates. And I think we had close to, and it hasn't been proved yet, but we was looking and said, well, this is going to have almost 15 colors in it.
Wow.
And there's, yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about your creative process here in a minute, but I guess I'd just like to ask, in terms of a group show or solo show that was particularly significant to you, what comes to mind?
Well, I think the Who Stole the TP show, was a big show, to be in. And
you want to kind of explain some of the
just,
artists and the
it was just, to me, it was like a show that sort of encompassed, all the important Native artists who were working at that time period. And you had Bob Halzoush, John Quick to See Smith. I mean, there was, countless others that I could name. There were artists from Canada, as well. And so it said to me, I thought it was a really, really great show. I think in terms of smaller shows, there was a show a number of years ago that Louis Ballard Jr. and I did up in Chicago, and it was called The Pathology of Symbols.
Oh, interesting.
And it was a show that was done in a very nice location in Chicago. Never got any press or anything, but it was a show, I think, that really kind of clarified, the direction of the work, because Louie and I would sit around and joke and talk about disturbance, like how there was, that this disturbance that exists in our culture and how our culture has been disturbed became the catalyst for making the images that we were making, in a sense. And so playing with that, and that I felt like that was also kind of a summation of all that work that was done when I was in graduate school, as well.
And Who Stole the Teepee? That traveled, right?
That traveled from
was it NMAI?
Yes, in New York City, and then it went to the II Museum.
Right.
Which is now what is it? It's got a new name. It's still the II Museum.
Yeah. And you did an All Osage show. That was. Did you enjoy that? That was.
Oh yeah.
In 2006, I guess. Just a little.
Yeah.
Did you go out for that though?
No, actually I didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't.
I
was trying to remember.
I don't think cricket was head then, but.
Yeah. Oh, this was down in Norman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was one of those I was teaching and I couldn't get
Right.
down at the time.
Right.
And I was trying to think of some other shows.
But it is neat that you guys are, so few in number. But
I think we're tied together. I mean, I look at like Anita and Yadika.
Yes.
So we visit, at the dances and that.
Right. Right.
And Anita and I visit quite a bit.
That's great.
As it is. So it's good.
Give each other support.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of your creative process, a bit more, you still prefer painting in oils on canvas when you're painting?
Primarily oils. I never liked acrylics. Acrylics feel plastic to me, and there's something about the oil paint that it's malleable. Mm-hmm. You can scrape it away. It takes a while for it to dry. You can build with it, in a sense. But I like the notion of an additive and reductive sort of painting process. To me, painting is not just about adding paint, but it's also removing and scraping away and uncovering and revealing.
So it's kind of like an editing. You might come back to your canvas and decide you want to get rid of some portion or rebalance.
Yeah, and oil paint. I don't know, just the feel. I'm pretty much a dedicated oil painter. When I was teaching at II, because of health and safety issues, we only taught acrylic painting. And I remember when I left II, I kind of jokingly told the dean, I said, yes, I get to teach oil painting. because they all knew that,
Right.
I kept on telling them, yes, I'm teaching this, but I said, I really do not like acrylics. And so, no, it's, so that's been oil paints, and then printmaking. I haven't done, primarily serigraphs and monoprints, and I did a fair amount of intaglio, but monoprints are probably where I'm focusing.
Okay.
More so.
Now is that but stone lithos or something you've also mentioned?
I have worked with stone litho in the past. I don't think it's my favorite.
Okay.
I'm doing lithos now, but basically I'm just doing the imagery.
Right.
The printer at the shop is actually doing all the printing, and there's something about lithography that as said, this is kind of new for me now, or at least is that I've always kind of struggled with the notion of additions. I like single pieces, and so the monoprints have always allowed me to create, smaller sort of original, or what I would call, I don't want to use the word unique, but singular works,
right,
in a sense. And when I got into doing monoprints, this has been something that's been going on for the last 10 years. And I did a whole suite of prints back in like 2001, 2002, and I laid off for a while, and I think it was about 5 years ago I started doing monoprints again.
Wow.
And part of it was I wasn't really thinking of them as being finished pieces. I was thinking of them as a means of generating ideas. And so the first few suites of prints that I did, they were very rough. It was just simply about getting ideas down on paper.
Wow.
For the most part. And then something happened. When I was in the shop, and I started realizing, well, wait a second. I can take these further, and I got much more engaged, in the making of them, cutting out stencils, started doing gum Arabic transfers, reduction printing, and all of a sudden what I found was that I had much more control over the image. The one thing I didn't like, and this is kind of ironic, me being a painter, is I actually didn't like the painterliness of monoprints.
Wow.
and it ended up that I was doing, when I found that I had more control over the image, I started embracing it. And I found now, as I said, I'm probably doing more printmaking than I'm doing painting right now. But I'm kind of transitioning out of that, and also what I was going to say, the model prints that I've been doing, they've led me to the lithographs, because the printer I was working with was kind of going, why don't you just do the lithos? Because it said essentially that's what you're trying to recreate in your model prints. And so, as I said, that's kind of what I'm working on now.
Taking you down it.
Yeah.
I was thinking, unlike, because of this non-realism, then you probably don't need to, or you don't do like sketches in a sense. Are you sort of attacking the canvas, playing with paint, or do you do thumbnail sketches?
It varies. I mean, my approach to painting really kind of depends on what I'm wanting to communicate. In the end, I rarely plan things out. When I say plan things out, I'm not doing a whole series of preparatory drawings and then all of a sudden trying to recreate that drawing, on a canvas. I may do a quick sketch of an idea, and then I sit back and sort of determine, well, what process do I need to, or how do I need to approach this to realize that idea, in a sense. And so sometimes I am very painterly, and it's about moving the paint around, till I sort of see an image. And then sort of go with that. And I like that sort of relationship between conscious and unconscious kind of image making. There's something that occurs when those two are working together that creates a fresh, kind of work. And to me, it also leads to discovery. A painting is about developing a dialogue. I have a dialogue with a piece. I'm not copying a piece, in a sense. And in that dialogue, hopefully some sort of new conversation, a new direction, a new tangent will occur that allows, me to sort of grow and find something new, in the work. And I approached painting that way for a long time. I think painting's shifting for me now a bit more because, when I first started off, I was doing plein air paintings. I was working from observation. As I've grown as an artist, I deal with more resource materials. But one of the things and I say this to my students, I said, when you understand how to work from perception and looking at nature, looking at an object, analyzing it, and interpreting it in paint, it informs your work in a way that when you are working from resource material, you're going to have a better grasp of it. If you never had that experience, you're not going to know how to translate it, in a sense, because you're going from 2D to 2D, and that can be problematic. As I said, the work that I'm doing now, I'm using primarily resource materials. And so it's a different type of process. There's a little bit more planning, in it. I don't know if you can see the painting behind me. I mean, I had to break down and again use the grid, in a sense, because I needed to translate that visual information, on the canvas in a somewhat accurate way, because a lot of the iconography that I'm working with today is maps, and we sort of assume or associate that maps are going to have the correct information, in a sense. So that's forcing me to kind of be a little bit more rigorous about how I'm trying to communicate, information. I have to be a little more specific in a way.
Well, I want to talk a bit about your iconography and your use of symbols and things, but let's just start with maps because, of course, that's an important tool for a lot of Native artists in terms of communicating, some information about different things, post-colonial, a perspective on
Yeah.
maps that's different from Native people than from non-Indians. Do you want to talk about how you might use maps differently?
For me, I think maps were about identifying with place, and understanding the boundaries and borders that were being set. And of course that's a whole colonial thing,
Right.
going on. I was fascinated with just, when you look at the state map of Oklahoma, the one that's published by the Department of Tourism or whatever, it says Osage County. But, you look at the Rand McNally map and it says Osage Indian Reservation. Of course, that's a whole other issue now.
Right.
After the court case. But I was fascinated with that, about how maps name place. The other thing that, occurred to me is that Osage lands extended well up into Kansas, into Missouri. And so the notion of place, when I look at a map, it's very restricting, for me. I had talked to my colleagues, here at KU, and I made a comment when I first came out as a visiting artist. I was driving through the tall grass prairie, just west of Emporia, and and growing up in Fairfax, Osage County, that's the southern tip of the tall grass prairie and Flint Hills, and I said, this is home to me, and so, when I look at the maps that are given to me, I'm realizing they only show a certain perspective on place. I sort of tell this story because when I drive home, because I go down 99 and I will turn west from Sedan, and I hop on this little dirt road and I drive home. And I start up in Kansas around Hewins. And there's no sign that says leaving Kansas, entering Oklahoma. None. I cross maybe a paved road, 60, and I can take another dirt road, and I can end up at my mother's house. and it's marvelous. Because there's nothing that says I've left and I've entered, a place.
Yeah.
And but maps to me, they are about colonialism. They're about defining and clarifying place, claiming. In my prints, I like to distort maps, and I like to move the borders around and shift things and make it confusing. So that when someone looks at it, they're wondering, well, why is Omaha, Nebraska, next to some little community in Central America, in a sense. And something that's been happening is because a lot of my work is about dealing with personal, and has dealt with sort of personal iconography, and personal symbolism, and it's been very sort of kind of connected to the notion of identity and place, and expressed in a very, as I said, personal way. I found the maps have allowed me to broaden my conversation. So a lot of the maps that I'm working with now are of the Americas. So we're looking at North America, South America, Central America. I think in the United States, when we say America, we have a tendency just to think of us, in a sense. Borders and boundaries, when you look at indigenous people, as I said, our homes, our memories, and our understanding of place extends beyond those boundaries that have been sort of prescribed to us. And the worst thing that could happen is we could agree to live in that. And let's face it, the reality is, yes, you have to, in a sense, but it doesn't mean that you can't have that understanding, of one place to another, in a sense. And to me, when you move those boundaries around, it's about acknowledging that indigenous people actually have lived all over the Americas. what's called a reservation, where we're put on a reservation, or whatever trust lands we have, and that's just a small portion of what we had, in a sense. I mean, someone told me one time, they said, well, how can you have a sacred place? How can you have a connection? This was a young man out in New Mexico, and I understood what he was saying. And I looked, I said, well, we have that too. I said, we weren't totally dislocated from our lands. I said, and that's why I came to KU, because to be connected or close to Missouri, to be connected to Kansas, that's still our homeland. Or it was our homeland. We still have a memory of that place, a blood memory in a sense that ties us to the landscape. It's a tall grass prairie. I chat with my sister, and she'll say the same thing. She's got, one of the most beautiful places, on this earth is that area west of Pawhuska. Going to Pawhuska to Fairfax or Gray Horse, that's it. There's nothing any better.
That was really well expressed. I'm, thinking about, just to continue your thought on, and I've read what you said about your particular mix of symbols and iconography, and Shauna Heap Birds wrote about it a bit too, and so you're using some things that symbolize different elements of Osage stories or culture, and then you're using other Western symbols, mixing them all. Is one of your goals to sort of bring people into your personal iconography, or is it to sort of let the viewer just free associate and draw what they...
It's kind of a mix of both. To me as an artist, I particularly enjoy creating narratives. And exploring narrative as a part of the painting, and that's a part of why I use this sort of iconography. I want the viewer to engage in the work, but I don't necessarily want them to see the world exactly how I see it. That somewhere, when they're looking at a painting, that they'll find something that they can connect with on a personal note. And I do want the paintings to inform, and enlighten, the viewer. It's kind of like political art. I struggle with political art that screams at the viewer. I like political art that's much more subversive, that somehow engages the viewer in looking, and all of a sudden sort of shifts their thinking without them knowing it. And so painting to me is very much, it's storytelling. I explore a lot of iconography, and my iconography comes from a number of different sources, and that's, I think, just my makeup. Today I think that's the makeup of young people. Today I'm looking at Osage. I'm looking at Western. I'm looking at whatever influences me at that time. I think about being a part of Ilonshka. That there's things that you hear in there, and you've heard, growing up, and they influence and they inform how you're going to move forward in life. Then there's things that you read, like La Flèche, being an academic and being in college. I realize that I'm intrigued with past writings. I think with everything that you get, in a sense, there's something suspect, about that. And now there are people who will praise or condemn.
Yeah.
And that's just natural. That's part of it.
Right.
But I try to utilize what I can to make rich paintings. I'm definitely not an authority. I would be the first person to say I don't know anything. In a sense, I sort of know what's kind of being given to me. In a sense, I try to utilize that to make my work. It's complicated because I think being being an artist and when you're dealing with certain types of knowledge, things happen. And there's always that notion of things being misinterpreted. I had mentioned that to you, I think, a little bit earlier, not in this particular interview, but you do deal with that. I realize a lot of times as a painter, I self-censor myself because, there's one side of me that's just simply an artist, and it's about personal exploration and expression. There's another side where you have a commitment to a community. And, if you have any sort of awareness to your obligations, to that community, then you become extremely aware of what's being said and what you're trying to communicate. So there's times where you pull back simply because that information doesn't need to be known by someone else. In a sense, that's actually what makes you and your people a unique group, in a sense. So work, and this is a struggle as an artist because I'm constantly getting questioned about iconography. Some people I'm quite sort of willing to share, and other times I just sort of am very quiet, saying, And a lot of times what happens is someone simply invents something, which is absolutely the most terrifying, kind of experience, and it ends up in press or something. But anyway, I think all of those things happen, when I'm thinking about making work, the one thing I definitely do not want to offend anybody from home. In a sense, but also want to be an artist and I want to express myself in a way that I can.
Well, one of the things I love about your Western symbols, like the lunchbox and the top one, is I think they really give a real whimsical quality.
They are.
To a lot of, and I wondered if you ever aimed at whimsy in some of these, because that comes through pretty strongly to me sometimes.
I don't think about it. It's funny, I rarely think of myself as being a humorous person. It just doesn't seem like my nature, but I do find, given the chance to kid and joke, and I'm around people at home that constantly,
I think it comes out in the heart a little.
constantly, are always teasing, and that's good. I do think that work can't be serious. There's a serious element, but it can't all be that. So there has to be a play thing. There has to be a fun. If you're not having fun making it, then there's a problem. And, some of the things that I put in, they may be very serious, in my connection to them, but they may come off as being playful. In a sense, I don't feel necessarily obligated to have to explain that, in a sense, because, there's parts of a work that, as I said, are simply yours. It doesn't have to be explained, and that's it. It's like, and there was an elderly lady at home one time. She was looking at some of my paintings, and she is like the age of my grandmother, who I never knew. And I've always had a connection to her. I always enjoyed visiting with her, having a cup of coffee at the cafe or whatever. And I remember one time she kind of looked at the painting. She said, "I know what you're painting about." And these were these large-scale abstract paintings. And I just kind of I walked away and I felt so good because I realized that something, it was making a connection, and it just was really good.
That was the best compliment.
That was, no one's ever, that's the best compliment I've ever had, about my work. And it simply came from someone from home who just, took a quick look, saw, the lunchbox, saw a few other symbols in there that I was looking at, and kind of went,
Yeah, that's wonderful. Can you tell me about your creative process? We'll just keep it to painting from the time you get an idea.
Ideally, if things are working for me, I have uninterrupted time in the studio, but that's not the reality of being a teacher. No, when I like to paint, I really have a preference to paint every day and to work, 4 or 5 hours a day. Because to me, there's something about that engagement. As I said, I can be obsessive, and I need that to really make it work. When I'm shifting and I'm breaking and I'm having to get away, and it's a week or a few days before I can get to the studio or whatever, then it becomes problematic. That I always feel like my ideas are changing. Something new is beginning to kind of, enter the picture in a way, and I find it much harder to make paintings,
So you start one project and you'll see it through.
And I'll try to. I've got to the point now where when I start to get 4 or 5 paintings in the studio, then I begin to have problems because I start to slow down, because I'm having trouble shifting from one to another. I think that's why I like printmaking, is because I'm in the shop and I know I've got a set time to make it happen, as well. The paintings, they've ranged anywhere from the large scale works, sometimes they'll happen in a month. Sometimes it takes 1.5 years for them to really, to really be realized.
To gel.
So
in that case, you're kind of leaving them for chunks of time.
Yeah. So I'll leave. I mean, I've got the piece behind me is one of those. I took it to the stage that I needed to take it, but now I'm stuck. I'm trying to figure out, well, what am I gonna do next? In a sense, because I really didn't plan it out completely. I just simply went, I've got this great idea. I found this nice Google Earth image, of this old village site in Kansas. And so I simply transferred it to this large scale painting, and then I'm doing research. I'm reading like Cutler's History of Kansas, which was wrote in the 1880s.
Wow.
And I'm reading accounts of this area, and I'm trying to find, well, okay, what kind of iconography that I can integrate into this painting that is not just about the past, but it's also about the present. Because the iconography that I work with, and one reason why I'm sort of fascinated with using symbols is that they don't function as stop signs, that they don't simply mean one thing, that they have multiple meanings, and that the symbol or the image can convey thought that transcends time, that it's both about the past, it's about the present, ideally something that's connecting, that's going to allow you to move forward, with your life. And so I think about that a lot when I'm painting, and so, because the last thing I want to do is to simply just recreate the past. That's not what it's about. And
We're going to have to take a look at that one. I finished one too here in a minute. I went among your artworks. We'll take a look at it in a few minutes. Okay, well, looking back over your career so far, what's been one of the high points? You might have mentioned it, but
I think the high point is the fact that I'm still able to do it. No, I can't really think of
today.
I can't really think of anything. Have been very fortunate, and there's been a lot of things. Did the print project, with the National Museum of the American Indian and the Art in the Embassies program.
Right. And that was
I think 2006. They did a little reception for us at the Blair House and got to meet Laura Bush, the first lady, and it was funny.
Yeah.
It was kind of one of those nice, you know what I mean? It was nice.
Right.
And but I mean,
And the
I don't know
embassy,
if
the
it- I don't
embassy
know if it-
exhibit traveled
it's
also
traveled,
internationally.
and it's going to different sort of venues,
Oh, it's currently
consulates, and that all over the world.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the reception as much as simply being a part of the project.
Oh, sure.
And that's turned into a lot of there's been a lot of interesting things happen out of that. I had a friend who emailed me a while back, a few years ago, and he said, I happened to see one of your prints in the consulate in Germany. And he said I was getting my visa renewed. He was living overseas at the time, and so he reconnected.
Yeah.
With someone, and but it's I think it's just the fact that I'm still able to do it. That's the main thing. I don't get real excited about. It's another thing. It's just
How about one of the low points?
Oh boy. As an artist, I think you put a lot of emotion, you put a lot of belief, you put a lot of yourself into your work, and when I finished up the work when I was in Illinois, I was real discouraged. And there was something about painting, about dislocation, that really bothered me. And I looked at all that work, and I don't think this actually might be my high point. I looked at all that work, and I didn't believe in it anymore. And it was 5 years worth of work. And then I started making paintings about home in a different light. Do you see what I'm saying?
Wow,
About
that
it
was a
went
big
from,
fork in the road for you.
it was the shift, and part of it was about, kind of losing faith, in a sense, as an artist. No, I've always felt fortunate, extremely fortunate.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we do look at some of your artwork?
I feel like we've talked about quite a bit. No, I think things, I'm fine.
Okay, well, we'll take a look at some of these paintings and prints. Okay, so we're looking at the painting that I know is in progress. It's
Yes.
not completed, but do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Sure. One of the things that happened when I moved to Kansas, I started thinking about, the Osage people and how, our history, in a sense, to Kansas, the fact that, it was our former homelands. And I started doing, some research, looking for like old village sites. And trying to find whatever information I could. I was looking at an old history book, Cutler's History of Kansas, which was written in the late 1870s, 80s, I think. I mean, I can clarify that, be sure. But it was, I was reading these physical descriptions of places where we lived. And the book itself was sort of broke up into like original inhabitants and then settlers. And so I thought it provided a very interesting sort of historical perspective on place. But as I was doing that, I started thinking about, well, where are these sites? And began to kind of research them, looking at whatever materials I could that kind of gave me an idea as to where these old village sites might be. And so this is one of those. I've got a few more that I'm working on too. As I said, it is an unfinished painting, but what sort of struck me about it is that I would take these road trips down to southeast Kansas, and And you know, I know good and well that the minute I get in the truck to go down, that it's not going to be what I think it's going to be, you know. But there's something about engaging in the road trip, the memory, and all of that, that you sort of go through these emotions, this excitement. Boy, I'm going to reconnect with a place in history. And you drive down, you find out, oh, it's a gravel quarry. It's a plowed field, you know, and you know that,
Yeah.
but there's something about that, making that kind of pilgrimage, that kind of connection. So I've been looking at a lot of different sources, and I've identified about 6 places that I'm trying to create these paintings from. And so, you know, I'm utilizing Google, like Earth, technology, maps, you know, to sort of discover these places. And I think about that. That's interesting that, you know, now today, that's how I'm finding place. It's not by car, it's not by horseback, it's not by walking, whatever, when you think of the history, you know, going and leaving a place. And so this is one of those particular pieces. It's interesting that I'm finding more and more, because I'm dealing with maps, that the computer is becoming like a sketchbook for me.
That's really interesting.
And it kind of came out of an experience one time where I happened to just sort of discover Google, and I like really focused in, and I found my house at Grey Horse.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, wow, this is interesting. They actually have an image of the house at Grey Horse. You know,
Yeah.
and I thought about this, and I went, well, wait a second. And I kept it at the same scale. I thought, can I move it step by step? And can I find Roan Horse's camp, which is where my family comes from?
Yeah.
And so I started moving it like one little bit at a time, at a bit, and I would follow this dirt road. Then I found this creek, and lo and behold, I found myself at Roan Horse's camp.
Wow.
And I thought, this is interesting. This is like a new way of, you know, navigating space, you know, in a sense. And then it dawned on me too, is that there's no way I could do that unless I had an intimate knowledge of the landscape. You know, of the place. So
it's still the base.
It's still the base.
It's still the base.
It's still the base for doing that. So the paintings that I'm working on now are trying to utilize, you know, more Google imagery and thinking about how technology plays a role in how we interpret, you know, place, you know, in a sense, our own home as well. Because I think there's a lot of scary things that are connected with technology too, you know, and how to utilize it to define home.
So would you like to talk about this print first?
Yeah, these are a couple of prints that were done in the last year.
The first one was called Arrival.
Arrival. And, you know, and so these are examples of my monoprints. You know, what you see is quite a bit of layering.
Yeah.
You know, in them. I'm working with a gum arabic transfer, and then reduction printing, and then actually utilizing stencils that I'm inking up, you know, as you know, as the third technique that I'm sort of working with. And what this does, it allows me to create a stronger composition, and it also allows me to emphasize a sense of depth, or that layering.
Right.
What I like about the printmaking process in monoprints, in traditional monoprints, when you pull the image off of the first print,
Right.
you have residue of ink left over. And a lot of times artists can reprint a second sheet, and that's called the ghost. You know, so it's a term. They'll just say, well, that's the ghost image. And I like that notion of the ghost image because it reflects something about past or residue, you know, from the past. And so the printmaking process, to me, it's a process that goes back and forth in time. You deal with the past, you deal with the present. And that layering is what really kind of excites me about this. I think early on in the interview, I talked a little bit about, you know, that certain times current events affect me. You know, in my work. And I have to admit that notion of immigration, the idea, who's an alien, who's an illegal alien, who's native, you know, those are terms that I'm a little bit at odds with. Particularly I think with what's been happening in Arizona and this whole notion of creating a fence, because you realize there were indigenous people that did cross the border into Texas, into Arizona, California, and going back and forth. And so in a way, that's why I'm playing with some of these maps, in my work. That's why I'm sort of expanding the dialogue to include the Americas and not just Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri.
Right,
in a sense. And also realizing that immigration and that moving across borders is driven by economy.
Right.
Everybody wants a better life. It doesn't matter who you are. We all want a better life in a sense. And so I kind of been playing with this in a very tongue-in-cheek way, because I've got, Alexander Hamilton, Grant, Washington, and they're sort of floating in these flying saucers.
Yes.
Like they're aliens waiting to cross the border. And of course they're also being welcomed. And what I find within the print's all based on stereotypes. They're all stereotypes of Anglo people, historical figures, and Indians too, because we see this particular image. It's the typical image that we see, and that particular image was actually appropriated out of a dictionary. It was the illustration for the word tom-tom, which I was just kind of going, I've never heard a native person call a drum a tom-tom. So it's a very playful kind of image. The darker print next to it is from probably the last series of works, and I started realizing with notions of immigration and everything that there very much so is a dark side to this whole colonialism. I'm playing and poking fun with it, and somehow the work started shifting to a darker palette. It may be a little bit difficult to see in there, but I'm actually using ship plans. You may not see it very well in this, and of course the imagery has changed to conquistador, a conquistador, and so the birds to me have always sort of functioned as a symbol on a number of different levels. The notion of migration, that birds migrate from one place to another. Also we migrate. Also freedom. Because as a kid, I can remember back at home watching birds, and what fascinated me about birds was they could navigate a space I could only imagine. There was a top, a bottom, and all the way around, whereas we're stuck by gravity, in a sense. And so this is, these are, as I said, a couple of the prints.
And you've got a woodpecker, a crow,
Waterbird, in there. Yeah. If you look, there's
that looks like almost a chain.
There is a chain. The image is actually inside a cathedral if you look at it too, as well. So there's all these different sort of layers.
Yeah.
That are occurring. I find as an artist, I do, as I said, I really struggle at times, because sometimes my work will say something, or it'll be very critical, of a certain institution, and yet I find as a person, I don't necessarily completely feel that way. It's a struggle that I've always kind of dealt with, in the work. I don't know if that's making sense, but you explore iconography because you realize part of the history.
Right.
It's a part of the history of how you got to who you are.
Right.
And in a sense, and so these are a couple of pieces. I've been utilizing this. I've been appropriating a lot of imagery lately, and one of the images I found was this image. Actually, I think I first found the image in Berghofer's book, White Man's Indian, and it was of a German or an Austrian woodcut. That was done in somewhere like 1506, 1503. And I looked at the image and I thought, wow, this is supposedly supposed to be one of the first real representations of indigenous people of the Americas. And as I was looking at the print, it was obvious that they were nothing more than Europeans dressed up as Indians. You know, in a sense, full beards, you know, the poses were very European, they weren't indigenous, you know, and so I just found it sort of, really intriguing. But I also at the same time, I kept on thinking, well, what's the most important element in this piece? I mean, it's obviously, first of all, it's a misrepresentation of indigenous people. And then it dawned on me, it was actually the two ships on the horizon, because that signifies the moment when the world changed. And so that's something I'm still kind of playing with in my art, a bit more. But and I always sort of described it. I said that's the moment, in a sense, indigenous people discovered the Europeans.
Right. Well, these are wonderful, and if there's anything else you'd like to add, or no?
I feel like I'm kind of talked out.
Okay.
In a way, I enjoyed the interview quite a bit,
Right.
an awful lot.
I appreciate your taking time for me today.